guys. Today's March 17th, 2021. Happy St. Patty's Day. We got a question regarding our pruning video. This is from WJ in Naples, New York. He said, I finished watching your instructional video on pruning apple trees with a central leader. I have about 18 apple trees that I've planted over the last 4 or 5 years. Nothing has been done to these trees as of yet. I need to start pruning and mulching. I'm hoping to train them to get above the deer browse level if that is possible. Is it possible to cut the lowest main branches off the tree every few years until the first branches are about 5 feet off the ground? I believe they are all semi-dwarf, but unfortunately didn't save tags that showed variety. Your video didn't say what region you're located in. I am in the Finger Lakes area of New York near a town named Naples, New York. Is it too late to prune this year? The ground still has some snow in spots, but temps are starting to warm. So we got a lot of questions we can answer here. First of all, we're here in Ohio, northern Ohio. Anybody's familiar with Cedar Point, the amazement park? We're about 35 minutes due south of Cedar Point or Lake Erie. You got Ohio, comes from the tips, you got this little dip right there. We're straight down, we're right in there. We're in zones, it's changed over the years, I think it's 6A now. But no, to answer your question, it's not too late, especially if you got snow on the ground yet, you're a little bit farther north than us. It's not too late to prune. I pruned into April. It's not going to hurt anything. They're still dormant. It's not really going to hurt them if they're coming out of dormancy. So to answer your question, we're in Ohio here. We're similar as far as weather goes. It's definitely not too late to prune. You want to start pruning, start now. Okay, so deer browsing and pruning your lower scaffold branches. You can do all that. Now, we've got the same problem here where we're at. Deer, this is deer central. They come through all the time. You'll see a lot of our trees have lower branches, and yes, they'll come through and they'll browse this stuff. They'll browse your buds off, your new leaves, your blossom buds. They will browse all that off. You can do a couple things. You can do like WJ's wanting to do, and which is what I'm doing. You can see here's a good example here. That's the goal on this tree. This is an older tree now, but I had some larger branches that were producing apples. I didn't want to take them off until my upper branches started getting, this is a tip-bearing variety that's going to bear on the tips. You got to know, that's another thing. Know what variety you have. Look up your apple varieties. Are they tip-bearing, semi-tip-bearing? Are they spur-bearing? All that determines on how you want to prune these. If you've got a tip-bearing apple tree and every year you're doing the standard 1/3 off of everything, you're never going to get any apples. So you need to understand what your tree does. This is semi-tip bearing. You'll see it's got spurs along the scaffold, but all these are going to get apples on them. So anyways, I just did this one this year. Took a big branch up because this particular variety has a spalier growth habit to it. It naturally wants to come out like that. I left this one on because I'm going to have a lot of apples on it. I'm not ready to take this one off yet. This one was really coming out here, and when you get a long scaffold and you get weight up from apples, then you got a chance of breaking and tearing, and that's not good for the tree. So I took this one out, and the deer were browsing the heck out of it anyways. These here are up a little bit higher. I could have trimmed this one off, but I want some apples there. But in a few more years, as these scaffolds grow out more, this one will come off. So a good practice, when your lower scaffold limbs get to 50% diameter of your trunk or greater, they should probably go. It's time to get new growth and move up the tree, or let new limbs come out down here. But you'll see I took one off here and I took one off here. So I'm going to touch on a couple things here real quick. I want to come back to this, how to cut this. But WJ, you've got trees that you've not pruned in 4 to 5 years. You're not sure if they are a semi-dwarf, a standard, or a dwarf tree. Now, if they're a dwarf tree, you're going to have problems getting those branches away from the deer. Dwarfs stay very small. Semi-dwarfs, these are all semi-dwarfs. These are Emla 7s and M111s. As you can see, an Emla 7, they'll get up to about 12 to 15 foot in height. So same here, all these. So you'll see, and I've let them grow up for that reason, because as those upper branches spread out, the lower ones are coming off. Until you get to that point, spray your trees. It's a lot of work, but when the deer are browsing and you've got them little buds, deer don't want them once they turn green and kind of leathery. They want them when they're tender shoots coming out. They want these tender buds when they start to open. Now, I've got a homemade deer repellent that works great. The only problem is you got to put it on every couple weeks, or if you get a hard rain, put it back on. But they absolutely hate this stuff. It'll actually change their travel patterns. They won't even come through here. We'll put the recipe up if anybody wants it, but it's roughly, it's a couple raw eggs, a cup of milk, just a little bit of dish soap, and some cooking oil. And you mix it all together in the blender. You got to blend it good. You got to get all the slimy parts of the egg whites all broken up, or they'll clog the tip of your sprayer. But you mix all that up, you blend it really good, and then you add it to a gallon of water. And you put this stuff, you spray it on there. Just spray it on the lower limbs. The deer smell it and they hate it. I've read that the deer hate the sulfur that comes from the eggs, and they hate the cow's milk. I put the hot sauce in for a little good measure. It doesn't necessarily need it. The oil acts like a binder to keep it on the tree and give it a little bit of staying power. Got about 25 trees here, so WJ, you probably got an area about this size. Doesn't take long. Get you a little 1 gallon to 3 gallon sprayer every couple weeks. I mean, you can mix this stuff up in less than 5 minutes. Put it in there, add water, come out and walk around. You're checking your trees anyway. Just hit your lower limbs. Hit your browsing height. You don't have to spray the whole tree. It's not going to do any good. Just come along here and hit your browsing areas. The deer hate this stuff. Years ago, when I first planted some trees, I read an I call it a wives' tale, put bars of Zest soap. It was specifically Zest soap. And it does stink, in my opinion. But they said, hang a bar of Zest soap from a tree. That's when I first bought this property. I hadn't even moved out here, and I wasn't even living out here, but I wanted to get some apple trees started. And I planted these trees, and I'm excited, and I come out a couple weeks later, and they were eating the shit out of them. Somebody said, oh, bar, Zest soap, just hang a bar of Zest soap from every tree. So, okay, I went and bought a bunch of Zest soap from the store, and I drilled holes in them and tied some twine, and I hung them on the trees. I come back a couple weeks later, and guess what? I had bites out of the Zest soap. The deer apparently liked the Zest soap. It didn't faze them. They were chewing on it. So, but this stuff, this deer repellent, if you buy the stuff from the stores, it's basically the same thing I'm telling you. This is homemade, it's easy and cheap to make, and it works. I swear by it. Like I said, this is Deer Central. You spray this enough times in a season, instead of coming right through your orchard, they're going to go around it because they hate the smell. So anyways, there's something you can do. Now back to the size of your tree. Like I said, you've got a semi-dwarf, it's going to go up great. Now let's talk about you haven't pruned those trees since you planted them, or maybe you planted trees years ago. You're someone and you just neglected them, and you want to start training them. You want to get that central leader back. So let's talk tools real quick. We talked about it before. A couple of essentials. Of course, pruners for your small limbs. Loppers, get up a little higher, a little bit heavier limbs. Pole trimmer, pole pruner. WJ, you need all this stuff. I'm sure you got it already. You've got 18 trees. These get you up in these smaller trees, get you up high. You don't have to get on a ladder. Very handy. And one of my favorite tools, I've talked about this before. This is a pruning saw. This is the Samurai. It's the Kanzawa Samurai. This thing cuts through wood like hot butter. I love it. I don't like using chainsaws because they rip and tear the bark. This gives you a nice, clean, controlled cut. That's what I did this limb with right here. Nice, clean, controlled cut, nice smooth edge. You're not ripping and tearing the bark, so that's going to heal over nicely. We're going to pretend this is an apple tree, that's a young apple tree, 4 or 5 years old, that's never been pruned. This is a Carmine Jewel cherry bush. I highly recommend it. It's a sour cherry. It gets black, almost black like a sweet cherry. Makes incredible pie. The secret to it is people want to pick it when it's red like a sour cherry because it is a sour cherry. Nuh-uh. You let them get turned black like a sweet cherry, and man, I've won awards at the fair with this stuff. It's awesome, and they're low maintenance, and these things grow like a weed. You don't prune them. I learned the hard way. You start pruning these, they get sickly and die. You let these things grow up like a bush. As they get older, they'll send out roots like we were talking about in a video yesterday about elderberries, how they send out lateral root systems, and they'll start sending up new shoots as they get older. So these things just spread like a weed. So anyways, I'm going to do a little pruning on this just to give you, to help WJ and others out. So let's pretend this is a little apple tree or any fruit tree, and you want to train a central leader on it, okay? And it's kind of been neglected. 2 things I've learned over the years. Number 1, don't go nuts your first year. Don't just hack a bunch of stuff out. For 2 reasons. Number 1, if you take off too much wood on this, you're going to shock your tree. And what it's going to do in reaction, because you got a root system down there that's grown in proportion to your tree, you hack a bunch out, it's going to send up what's called water sprouts. And they don't have too many water sprouts anymore, but you'll just get all these growing straight up, straight up, straight up, straight up, all over the place. It's compensating. You don't want to go down that road because now you got to do a lot more pruning, and it really slows your tree down. Number 1, you don't want water sprouts. Number 2, young trees, their bark, their skin is like our skin. Okay, what do we do when the sun comes out? We either wear clothes, we put sunscreen on. What happens if we don't? Well, a lot of us, like me, being fair skinned, we burn. Guess what? Trees will burn. They will get sunburned. They've got all this green foliage that's been growing up for years. That is actually their shade, their protection from the UV rays. And they've got this tender wood in here. You take their you take too much of this off to take their protection, this is going to burn, and I'll show you what it'll do. Well, talking about sunburn, I'm going to give you a perfect example of sunburn. This is an old wild tree, and I decided one year, this is years ago, I decided, hey, I'm going to cut this thing back and I'm going to graft good apples on, because they had just nasty little hard knotty apples. They weren't even good for cider. So I had this bright idea. I'm going to cut all my limbs back, everything, and I'm going to graft onto it. Well, back then, this was a huge tree with a huge canopy. It didn't have heavy bark. If you got a tree with heavy bark on there, that's its protection. It's not going to burn. But back then, it had this lighter bark like this right here on it, this tender bark. Okay, I cut this thing wide open, and all of a sudden I get dead spots. Well, it got sunburned. And just like if you get sunburned bad enough, you'll blister and peel. Trees do the same thing. They blister and peel. Now you can see it's been growing back, but it's taking a long time. I actually I'm not a big user of tar sealer on trees, but this warranted it, because if I didn't do this is taking it so long to heal, this was going to get infested by insects and start rotting, and then I'd lose this whole limb. So I covered it with a tar sealer, and then I put white. Tar sealer is black, so you're going to add to the problem. That's going to absorb heat. So I did the tar sealer, and then I did a white latex 50-50 solution. When I say 50-50, I mean 50% paint, 50% water, and just wipe it on there. So this is what can happen. This is a larger example. See this tender bark on there? But this is as it's growing. This is exposed to the sun. But this is what can happen to your trees if you open them up too quick. So let's go back to our example here. First thing you want to do, if you got a tree that's real compact inside, this is nice. But let's say you got a bunch of branches just they're wrapping around each other, they're doing all, you know, they're twisting on each other and things like that. Crossing branches need to go. Okay, so the first thing you want to do, you want to think about getting air into the center of your tree. So like here's one right here. You got a double scaffold here. I would take this one out. That's gonna, you got one crossing across the tree. I would take that one out. I'm gonna do it just like I said. I've got several of these bushes, not gonna hurt anything. So watch what just a couple cuts will do. We're gonna take this one out. We're gonna take this one out. And again, same thing, even these smaller branches have a growth ring. You'll notice I'm not cutting up against the bark. I'm leaving a little nub there so that heals properly. Okay, here's another crossing branch. Got two crossing branches. See how these are crossing and competing with each other? And so we're going to take this one off. Now look how that opened this up. There's one crossing here. Just take that one out. Not too much. You take that out. Look around your tree. Here's one that's crossing back. Anything that points back to the center of your central leader, you want to take that out. Because what happens when you get crossing branches? You get wind, you get this. And before you know it, both of these have wounds on them. So that's why you take crossing branches out. Here's another one pointing back to the center. Take that out, pointing back to the center. And don't take this little bit off here and try to save that. You want to cut down here, pointing back to the center. Let's get rid of that one. So this is your apple tree. First thing you're doing, get any branches that are pointing back to the center of the central leader. That's not natural. You don't want them pointing back because they're going to keep going that way. They're going to cross. They're going to compete with the rest of the tree for sunlight. Here's a scaffold. It's got a smaller one coming off the side. We'll take that one off. We'll take a look at it. Look around. See, it's pretty open. I would not, your first year, worry about spacing your scaffolds. Again, if I work on a neglected tree, it's a 3-year process. The first year, I'm opening the center like I'm showing you. Opening the center. And maybe taking out some big branches, but I want to keep that. I don't take anything off the outside canopy because you need more sunlight's going to get in there and your bark is slowly going to adapt to that. So open up your center, maybe take out a couple. If you've got two main scaffolds coming up, it's not going to hurt to take one out. Your second year, you're going to take off about 1/4 to 1/3 of your outside canopy. That's when you're going to start working this like this. Bringing that back in a little bit, getting our controls. The ones that have good shape, the third year, you say, that's a good scaffold, I'm keeping that. Don't worry about that one so much. Trim the other ones back a little bit. Your third year, you're going to thin more of these scaffolds out. You're going to thin them out. So your scaffolds, you want them ideally to be at about a 45-degree angle, 40, 45 degrees. You don't want them coming straight out. I know it looks nice, but depending on the variety it is, if you got it coming straight out and you get a heavy fruit load on there one year, that's going to break right off. I've had it happen. There's strength in this angle. So you get a lot of fruit on this. There's strength in that angle. It's less prone to break off than one that's sticking out flat like this. You do want them to go out sideways, but you don't want them flat sideways. Let your smaller tertiary scaffolds, let them go flat, but keep a little bit of an angle there. So back down to the bottom now. You've got, your question was, can I start taking some off? Absolutely. What I would do this year, if this was my little apple tree that I just started pruning, I've cleaned out the inside a little bit. There's one pointing in. We'll get rid of that one. Here's one pointing in. So we get rid of these pointing in like that. There's one. And I'm actually cutting cherries off right now, but that's okay. That'll be good for the other cherries. But typically these cherry bushes, you leave them alone. They do better if you just let them do their thing. See, here's another one coming in, crossing over this one. We'll take that one out right there. And always come back in. Come into a crotch, come into here. Don't get away from cutting out here and taking 1/3 of everything off, because as I've said in the other videos, you've got 3 kinds of wood on a tree. And we're talking specifically fruit trees. You have growth wood, you have fruiting wood, and you have dormant wood. Okay, your fruiting wood is this. That's your fruiting wood. Okay, and this stuff is controlled by a hormonal activity. You've got fruiting wood here. You've got your growth wood, and that's your scaffolds coming out. That's your growth wood. You've got your dormant wood. There's dormant wood all over this. So if you do cut something off that dormant, or there's damage to the tree, that dormant wood's going to activate. Now, the hormonal part. WJ, if you've got trees that's got spurs on them that are producing apples, you don't want to start hacking a third off of everything, because it changes the signal that's sent to this tree. Okay, let's go back to an apple tree real quick. These are called terminal buds. You'll notice this one kind of looks kind of crazy, but I'm doing that for a reason. See these? These are spurs. These are blossom spurs, okay? Those blossom spurs develop because I let these terminal buds develop. A terminal bud, what's going to happen, what will happen on this terminal bud this year is it will do something like, let me find a good example here. This is not a good tree for example. You'll get 3 or 4 coming off of it. You'll get 3 or 4, okay? It's called fractal. That's what trees do naturally. They'll grow up, you leave a terminal bud, this will get 3 or 4, and they'll kind of bush out like a flower. Nothing wrong with that. They're also sending out at the same time a hormone. I'm done growing. It's time for fruiting wood to activate. Okay, but if you come out here every year and you snip off a third of your growth on every, that signal never gets down here. What you're doing, you're cutting that off and you're activating the growth wood. Says I'm not done growing yet. So it's going to start on all these buds that would have become blossom spurs this year. They're going to start growing out new limbs, okay? By leaving a terminal bud. This was a terminal bud last year, and you see what it did when I let it grow. It grew out again. Now this year it'll fractal. It'll go out into multiples. But by letting that terminal bud stay here, it says, hey tree, we're done growing here. Start producing some fruit. We've done our job. If I would have snipped this back here last year, we wouldn't have these blossom spurs. We'd have a bunch of branches coming out. So decide, here's another good example. Look at all the blossom spurs on this branch. That's because I didn't take off the terminal bud last year. I want this one off this year. I didn't take that terminal bud off last year. It said it's done, I've done my job. Get some fruit on here. If I'd have cut this back last year, we wouldn't have those on there. How do I know? Because I did it the wrong way for many years. I'm like, why am I not getting any apples? Because I was always taught, cut off a third of everything every year. Well, some trees react very poorly, and especially if you've got a tip bearing or a semi-tip bearing. So, I know I'm giving you a lot of information, and you can back it up. If you've got other questions, just ask me. So, watch what you're doing. If you've got a tree that's bearing fruit or you want to bear fruit and you've got a nice scaffold, don't go crazy and cut off your terminal buds this year. Let them grow and you're going to develop spurs on that scaffold. We're going to bounce back one more time to our imaginary apple tree here. So the last thing we got to do, we've got crossing branches out. We've opened up the center a little bit here. Get some air and sunlight going in there. Anything pointing back in, get rid of that. There's a cross. Look at this. Right here's a perfect example. If you can zoom in on that. This branch, all winter long, see where it's rubbing on there? Think about there's 2 bigger branches. That's where disease and decay get in. So we want those out of there. So anyways, anything going straight up. So we've got air going to it, okay? We want to take off. We want to take off maybe 2, maybe 1. Don't have to do a lot. So we can take this one off. I'm going to pretend I'm not going to do it because I want these cherries this year. I would take this one off, and you want your branches to stagger. Obviously, if this is an apple tree, this would be a stagger. This would be a stagger. You want to get some space between. You don't want crotches like this. You don't want 2 scaffold limbs coming at the same point. That creates a weak point in the tree. someday, if you get a heavy windstorm or a heavy loaded, fruit loaded year, this is where it's probably going to break because that's a weak spot. So typically what you want to do when you got a crotch like that, take one or the other off, whichever. See, I would take this one off. This is a better looking scaffold. So I would take, this year I would take this one off and I would take this one off. And that's it. Next year, take another one off, or in the next 2 years, and work your way up. Just like you said, WJ, you want to work your way up to a point where it's out of the way of the browsing height the deer, and also easier to manage, to mow around, to mulch around, to pick your apples. There's a lot of advantages when it comes time for pruning. The higher up you are, it's a lot nicer. So here's another one. If you get a scaffold that branches off, you got a scaffold here, but it's got a side branch coming off. It's the same size as this one. You don't want that, that's competing. Keep the smaller ones there. Let that keep growing out. So, but you can see, there's one pointing back in. So, and that's it. Just a little bit. It's easy to be an over pruner. I did it for a long time. But we've opened it up. Okay? Let's say that's a little bit more of an acute angle than I would like, but this is a bush, but this is one I would like better. So what I would do, I'd let this one grow for a few years, producing its fruit. When that one gets big enough, it's spreading out. If we get in the point where they're rubbing each other, okay, now take this one out because you're stepping up to this one. Give it time, do it over the years. Think about long term on this, because once you cut a branch off, you can't put it back. The tree will heal itself, but it's going to take a lot of years to get that branch back if you want it. So that's something I learned over the years. Think about it. You can always, if you're unsure, you can always do it summertime, midsummer. We'll talk about summer pruning. You can always do it later, and you can do it next year. But if you cut it off and say, man, that was a good one, you can't put it back on. So I hope I've answered all your questions. Work your way up slowly. A lot of these trees, well, some of these, the first trees I planted in this property, and well, I experiment. Okay, vase shape, central leader. Well, let me show you something. For any of you saying, why would you go central leader? Well, like WJ said, if you got deer problems, it's a real good reason. But here's some that I experimented. And some trees, some varieties will not. You can spend years, like I did with this one, fighting it. I fought and fought and fought to try to get this thing to shoot up a central leader. Didn't want to do it. It's the growth habit of this variety. This is a foxwell. This is a very sharp, acidic apple for cider. But I tried to force this thing. It did not. It wanted to do what it's doing. I'm like, okay, you win. You can be a vase shape, open. I cut this out, and now I'm going to have all kinds of. This is another tip bearing. But you see all these. This thing really, when I opened up the vase shape, got the sunlight in there, it really started taking off. Trees like this one, this is Grimes Golden. It wants the central leader. It wants it. This was an easy one to train. Here's another good example of a proper cut. Remember when I told you, you don't want a crotch here. I said, okay, balancing the tree, I want this side, took this one off, but I cut it properly. Look how that healed over. Here's one that healed many years ago, another one. You can see, to answer your question again, WJ, every year you're doing a little bit. These are from over the years. And some of these are going to want to come back. And there'll be a point where you want to cut those and let new growth come out. Old growth on an apple tree will slow it down eventually. That's when you want to get new growth. Study orchards. If you got orchards in your area, that's where I've learned a lot. Just drive by, slow down, watch what they're doing. Walk through them when you're picking apples, picking peaches, picking pears. See what they're doing. See what the pros are doing. You'll learn a lot from them. You'll see where they'll have bigger branches on the bottom, and they'll cut them back, and they'll let new growth come out. They're establishing a new scaffold. It'll grow back a lot quicker on a bigger established tree. But there's times when, okay, again, going back to that 50% rule, it gets 50% or larger, cut that off because you got a lot of weight there. And let a new one come up, or let one up above come up. So this is one of my favorites. This is a great example. Here's a crossing branch. I haven't really worked on this one yet, but this is a great apple. This is Grimes Golden. It's the parent of Golden Delicious, that little tree over there. Every year I'll take when they do produce, anyone's curious about apples, I'll hand them a Grimes Golden and I'll hand them a Golden Delicious. Golden Delicious look prettier, they always do, but I'll say take a bite of it. I'll say, which one do you like? They always point to the pretty apple, just like you do in the grocery stores. I said, now take a bite of each one. Ooh, this is much better. Grimes Golden, it's never failed. Never had anybody, once they taste them, I've never seen anybody pick the Golden Delicious over the Grimes Golden. Golden Delicious, Red Delicious, they've all been bred for looks. Big, pretty, perfect red or yellow apples. They've bred the flavor right out of them. This isn't as pretty of an apple. Still a nice apple. It's yellow. It's got a nice little pinkish red blush on one side. But it doesn't, if you set them side by side, everyone says that. Oh, I like this one better. It doesn't hold a candle to a Golden Delicious. But when you bite into it, it wins the competition. So here again, look at these spurs here. I'm going to show you one more time and then I've talked enough. Here's a crossing limb. But this has spurs on it. See this? It's got spurs. I really don't want to take that off yet. This one I can take off. I don't mind that. But look at this. This is another one. Last year had a terminal bud there. Okay, I could have said, oh, I'll take this one off. No, let that terminal bud grow. You're going to have apples. Apples produce on third-year wood. This will be second-year wood this year. Okay, last year that was first year. That was green last year. This year's second year. Leave that terminal bud on there. If I trim that back, this won't get blossom spurs on it. It's gonna, all these are gonna activate that dormant wood and they're gonna say, oh, we need to grow some more because it didn't send down that hormone. Okay, so this is 1 year growth. This was second year growth for last year. That was from the previous year. By leaving that terminal bud on there, it got spurs on it. This is third year wood. Guess what? We're gonna have apples on it. As long as we don't get a late freeze or something like that. So I hope this helped. If you have any questions, please let us know. Thank you. Hey, 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 hey.